The morning Edna Garrison walked into the Harlan County Courthouse with nothing but the clothes on her back, a folded letter pressed against her chest, and a heart full of righteous fury. Every man in that dusty hall turned to look at her, and not one of them expected her to win. It was the autumn of 1882, deep in the hill country of Texas, where the land rolled like a sleeping giant beneath a sky so wide it could swallow a person's grief whole. The town of Caldwell Crossing had grown from a cattle stop into something resembling a real settlement over the past decade. It had a post office, a general store, 2 saloons, a church with a crooked steeple, and a courthouse that doubled as the town hall on Tuesdays. The railroad had come close enough to matter, and with it came money, speculation, and men who smelled opportunity the way buzzards smelled a carcass. Men like Victor Hollies. Edna was 32 years old, a widow of 14 months, and she had not yet cried in public. She had cried in private, in the dark hours before dawn when the house felt like an empty church, when she would press her face into the pillow her husband Thomas had used and try to remember exactly the sound of his voice. But in daylight she was composed, deliberate, and absolutely unyielding. She stood 5'4" in her worn boots, with brown hair pinned firmly beneath a hat that had belonged to Thomas, and she had eyes the color of creek water in October, gray-green and quiet and deep. She was not a woman who invited pity, and she did not receive it from Caldwell Crossing. What she received was suspicion, bureaucratic obstruction, and a lawsuit that threatened to take from her the only thing she had left. The Garrison land was 340 acres of good grazing pasture and timber along Cutter's Creek. Thomas Garrison had filed the deed in 1874, paid for the land in full with money he had earned driving cattle up from San Antonio, and had built on it with his own hands a house, a barn, 2 wells, and a smokehouse. He and Edna had worked that land together for 8 years, raised their daughter Clara there, buried a son there in the small plot behind the cottonwood. They had known hardship and drought and the particular loneliness of the frontier, but they had known it together, and the land had felt like the solid proof of their life. Then Thomas had died of pneumonia in August of 1881, and Victor Hollies had appeared by October with a deed of his own. Hollies was a land speculator who had arrived in Caldwell Crossing on the back of railroad money. He was 45, thick in the shoulders, with a politician's smile, and a lawyer from San Antonio named Prescott, who wore a black coat that never seemed to gather dust. The deed Hollies produced claimed that Thomas Garrison had sold him the property in July of 1881, 1 month before Thomas died, for the sum of $400. It was signed, notarized, and recorded with the county clerk. It appeared entirely legitimate. It was, Edna knew with absolute certainty, a forgery. Thomas had been bedridden by July. He had barely been able to hold a spoon, let alone travel to a notary. He had spoken to Edna in those final weeks about the land, about Clara, about the future, and he had never once mentioned selling. He had made her promise to hold on to it. He had made her promise 3 separate times, with the particular insistence of a man who feared something he could not name. She had held his hand and promised, and she had meant every word. But promises did not carry legal weight in the Harlan County Courthouse, and Victor Hollies had a deed. The legal proceedings had dragged through the spring and summer of 1882. Edna had scraped together enough money to hire a local attorney named Buell, who was a decent man, but admitted freely that he was outmatched by Prescott's experience and connections. The county judge was a man named Harold Farris, who had been appointed the previous year and who, Edna had come to believe, owed Victor Hollies more than a passing favor. The hearing date had been set and reset twice, and now it was October, and Edna was walking into that courthouse with nothing but a folded letter, the memory of her husband's final weeks, and a nerve that had been hardening inside her chest like iron since the day Hollies' man had nailed a notice to her front door. She also had, although she did not yet know it, Clark Rourke. He was sitting on the wooden bench outside the courthouse when she arrived, his hat tilted down over his face against the morning sun, his long legs stretched out before him and his boots crossed at the ankle. He looked like a man who had been riding a long time. His coat was trail-dusted, his jaw was unshaved, and there was a quality of stillness about him that was different from laziness. It was the stillness of a man who had learned to conserve himself. He was 35, lean and broad-shouldered at once, with dark hair that curled slightly at the collar and the kind of face that would have been handsome in any era, but seemed particularly at home under a wide western sky. His hands were rough. His eyes, when he pushed his hat back and watched Edna march up the courthouse steps, were the particular dark amber of aged whiskey, warm and clear and faintly dangerous. He watched her with frank attention. There was nothing impolite in it. It was more the attention a man gives to something he recognizes as significant before he can explain why. Edna did not notice him. She was entirely focused on the door ahead of her. The courtroom, such as it was, consisted of 15 rows of wooden benches, a raised platform with Judge Ferris's desk, 2 tables for the opposing parties, and a gallery of roughly 30 Caldwell Crossing residents who had come to watch. Word had gotten around about the Garrison case. People had opinions. Most of those opinions, Edna suspected, ran in Hollis's favor, not because people liked Hollis, but because he had money and lawyers and the county clerk in his corner. And in this part of Texas in 1882, those things mattered more than most people would say out loud. She took her seat beside Buell. Buell patted her hand and told her to let him do the talking. She nodded but kept the letter in her own pocket. Victor Hollis arrived 5 minutes later with Prescott and 2 other men whose function appeared to be purely decorative. They sat behind Hollis and looked expensive and smug, and Hollis himself glanced at Edna with the particular dismissiveness of a man who has already decided the outcome. Judge Ferris entered and called the court to order, and the hearing began. Prescott opened with the deed. He was good. Edna had to grant him that, smooth and methodical, laying out the case as though it were simple arithmetic. His client had purchased the property in good faith. The deed was properly filed and notarized. The widow had no competing documentation, no witnesses to a contrary transaction, and no legal grounds for challenging a properly recorded instrument. He spoke for 20 minutes and made it sound absolutely settled. Buell rose and did what he could. He challenged the timing. Thomas had been ill, and he raised the question of Thomas's capacity to enter a legal agreement in July of 1881. He was competent but cautious, and Edna could feel the courtroom's interest beginning to drift toward the inevitable conclusion everyone seemed to expect. Then Judge Ferris leaned forward and said, in a tone that had a particular finality to it, "Mrs. Garrison, does your counsel have anything further to present?" Buell started to say no. Edna stood up. "Your Honor," she said, and her voice was perfectly steady, "I have something to present." Ferris looked at her with mild irritation. "Mrs. Garrison, your counsel speaks for you in this proceeding." "My counsel has my permission to sit down," Edna said. "I have evidence that has not been entered. I have a letter, written in my husband's own hand, dated the 12th of July, 1881. The same week this supposed deed was signed, in which he makes no mention of any sale and speaks at length about his plans for the land the following spring." She held up the folded letter. "I also have the name of the notary listed on that deed, a man named Aldous Crane, who I have since learned passed through Caldwell Crossing exactly once, in the company of one of Mr. Hollis's business associates, and who has not been seen in this county before or since." The room was very quiet. Hollis leaned toward Prescott and said something low and urgent. Prescott rose. "Your Honor, the witness is out of order. She is not testifying under any recognized procedure. The letter is personal correspondence, and the letter," Edna said, still on her feet, "is in my husband's handwriting, which anyone in this town who knew Thomas Garrison will recognize. And the notary who supposedly witnessed his signature is a ghost." "That is a serious accusation," Ferris said, and there was something careful in his voice now, something that had not been there before. "It is a true one," Edna said. I am asking this court to order an investigation into the identity and credentials of Aldous Crane before any ruling is made. That is not an unreasonable request." The gallery had come alive. People were leaning toward their neighbors. A woman too rose back, had her hand pressed over her mouth. Holly's face had gone a particular shade of red that Edna found privately satisfying. It was then that the door at the back of the courtroom opened and Clark Rourke walked in. He walked to the bar without being invited, removed his hat, and addressed Judge Ferris directly. "Your Honor, my name is Clark Rourke. I'm a licensed land surveyor out of Austin, and I've been retained by the Texas Land Office to look into irregularities with deed filings in this county." He produced a folded document from his coat pocket. "I have a letter of introduction from Commissioner Bassett. And I have information regarding a notary named Aldous Crane that I believe is directly relevant to this proceeding." The silence in that courtroom was absolute. Ferris stared at him. Holly stared at him. Edna turned and looked at this man she had never seen before in her life, and felt something she could not immediately name. It was not hope exactly, though hope was part of it. It was more like the feeling of a door opening in a room you had decided was sealed. "You may approach," Ferris said slowly. What followed was 3 hours of the most intense legal proceedings Caldwell Crossing had ever witnessed. Clark had been in the county for 6 days, working quietly, following the trail of irregular deed filings that the Texas Land Office had flagged. Aldous Crane, it turned out, was not a licensed notary in the state of Texas. He appeared in 3 separate irregular deed filings across 2 counties, always in the company of Holly's associates, always on documents that benefited Holly's land acquisitions. The signature on Thomas Garrison's deed did not match Thomas's handwriting on file with the county recorder. Clark had obtained a comparison sample from the original homestead filing. One by one, the fabrication unraveled. Prescott tried to object, then tried to redirect, then fell into a silence that had the quality of a man watching a building collapse. Holly's himself grew very still in the way that animals go still when they have run out of options. Judge Ferris recessed the court for 1 hour. When he returned, his manner had undergone a subtle but significant shift, the particular shift of a man who has calculated which way the wind is now blowing. He ordered the challenged deed suspended pending a full investigation by the Texas Land Office. He directed the county sheriff to detain Victor Holly's and contact the authorities in San Antonio. He acknowledged Edna's letter as a valid and significant piece of contradicting evidence. He did not apologize for the 14 months he had allowed this proceeding to drag on, but he ordered it stopped, and for now, that was enough. Edna stood outside the courthouse afterward in the October sunlight, and for a moment she simply stood still and let the tension she had been carrying for over a year begin, very slowly, to release from her shoulders. It felt physical, like setting down a heavy load. The light was thin and golden, the kind of light that makes the dust look beautiful, and she breathed it in once deeply, and then she turned to find Clark Rourke standing a few feet away, hat in hand. "Mrs. Garrison," he said. "Mr. Rourke," she said, "I don't know whether to thank you or ask you what took you so long." Something shifted in his expression, surprise first, and then something warmer. "Fair question. I arrived in the county 6 days ago and I've been gathering documentation. I didn't know the hearing had been moved up." "It was moved up 2 weeks ago," she said. "Without notice to my counsel." He absorbed that. "I apologize for the timing, but the evidence is solid. Holly's has been running this scheme in at least 2 counties. The land office will have enough to prosecute." Edna studied him. He was direct, she noted, not in the blunt way of men who had no manners, but in the way of someone who thought honesty was simply more efficient than its alternative. She appreciated that. "Were you retained specifically to look into my case?" she asked. "I was retained to look into deed irregularities in Harlan County. Your case was the most urgent, so it became the focus." He paused. "You should know, when I arrived and started asking questions, it was the people who knew your husband who pointed me in the right direction. There are people in this town who believed you from the start." That hit her somewhere unexpected, and for a brief moment the composure she had been maintaining wavered. She looked away down the street, where a group of men were emerging from the courthouse and talking in low, urgent voices, and she pressed her lips together. "Will you have coffee?" she said when she had collected herself. "It seems the least I can do." He looked at her with those whiskey-warm eyes and said, "I would be glad to." They walked to the Caldwell Crossing dining hall, which served as the town's closest approximation to a restaurant, and they sat across from each other at a corner table with 2 cups of terrible coffee and the particular awkwardness of 2 people who have just been through something significant together and are now trying to determine what, if anything, that means. "Where are you from?" Edna asked. "Originally, Missouri. I came west 12 years ago, started working surveys for the land office about 6 years back." "Do you have family?" A slight pause. "No, my wife passed in 1878, fever." "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it in the particular way of someone who has also lost a person entirely too soon. He looked at her steadily. "You have a daughter, Clara. She's 9. She's at our neighbor Mrs. Hatch's place today." Edna wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "She knows something is happening, but not all of it. I didn't want her in that courtroom." "Wise." "She looks like Thomas," Edna said, not planning to say it but saying it anyway, and then she stopped. Clark did not fill the silence with anything, which she found she was grateful for. He let it be, and they drank their terrible coffee, and outside the window Caldwell Crossing went about its October business, and Edna felt, for the first time in a very long time, that she was sitting in the company of someone who was genuinely present. The investigation moved quickly over the following days. The Texas Land Office sent 2 additional men, and the county sheriff, who had clearly been nervous about the whole Holly's business all along, proved surprisingly cooperative once the weight of the state's authority arrived. Victor Hollis was charged with fraud and forgery and taken to San Antonio under escort. Prescott, seeing the direction things were moving, provided a signed statement in exchange for lenient consideration and promptly disappeared from Caldwell Crossing, presumably to begin making different kinds of trouble somewhere else. Clark stayed in town. He had documentation to complete, affidavits to file, reports to send to Austin. He took a room at the boarding house on Elm Street and worked methodically through the days, but in the evenings he found himself, with increasing frequency, at the table near the window in the Caldwell Crossing dining hall, and Edna, with increasing frequency, found reasons to be there as well. It was not, at first, anything either of them named. They were careful people, both of them people shaped by loss into a particular kind of caution. But they talked, easily and at length, in the way that happens when 2 minds are genuinely compatible. They talked about land and law and the particular injustices of a system that left widows at the mercy of forged documents and compromised judges. They talked about Thomas and about Sarah, Clark's wife, with the honesty that can only happen between people who have both known grief and therefore do not require it to be performed or minimized. They talked about Clara, and one evening Edna brought Clara along, and Clark spoke to the girl with a naturalness that made Edna notice him differently. Clara was a serious, watchful child who had her father's dark eyes and her mother's way of looking directly at a person. She regarded Clark with the frank assessment of a child who has been through too much too soon and therefore wastes no time on pretense. "Are you the man who helped Mama keep our land?" she asked. "I helped," Clark said. "Your mother did most of the work herself." Clara considered this. "She is very brave." "She is," Clark agreed, and glanced at Edna, and Edna looked down at her coffee cup because something in the simplicity of that agreement affected her more than she wanted it to. After Clara had occupied herself with a piece of pie and a copy of a newspaper someone had left behind, Clark leaned slightly forward across the table and said quietly, "I wanted to ask you something, and I want you to feel entirely free to say no." "All right," Edna said. "When the work here is finished, and it's nearly finished, I was thinking I might stay a while longer in Caldwell Crossing. Not on land office business. On my own account. He looked at her directly. I think you know why I'm saying that. The dining hall was not empty. There were 3 other tables occupied, and Mrs. Prentice from the general store was certainly within earshot, and Edna was aware of all of that. She was also aware that her heart was beating in a way it had not beaten in a very long time, not painfully, but insistently, with a kind of urgency she had stopped expecting. I know why you're saying it, she said. I just want to be honest with you about where I am. I am not the person I was before Thomas died. I don't know exactly who I am yet in some ways. I have the land now, I hope, and I have Clara, and I'm still figuring out what that life looks like. I'm not asking you to have it figured out, Clark said. I'm asking whether I might be part of the figuring. She looked at him for a long moment. The October light was coming through the window at a low angle, catching the dust in the air and making it golden, and he was watching her with that steady, patient attention that she had come to think of as specific to him, not pressuring, not demanding, simply there. Yes, she said. You might. The formal ruling on the Garrison land came down from Judge Ferris 2 weeks later. The fraudulent deed was declared void. The property reverted fully and uncontestedly to Edna Garrison as sole heir and rightful owner of the estate of Thomas Garrison, deceased. It was 3 paragraphs in the official court record, and it was, Edna thought, the quietest version of a victory she had ever seen. She read it sitting at the kitchen table of the house Thomas had built, with the morning light coming through the window and a cup of real coffee steaming beside her, and Clara asleep upstairs, and she pressed her hand flat on the page and said, to the empty kitchen, or perhaps to Thomas, we kept it. Then she folded the ruling carefully and placed it in the wooden box where she kept the important papers, and she went out to see about the fence on the south pasture, which had been neglected during the months of legal strain. Clark came out to the property 2 days after the ruling. He arrived in the late morning with a post-hole digger borrowed from the hardware store, and the information that the south fence was in fact his professional assessment of a priority repair. Edna, who was already out there with a hammer and a pile of new fencing boards she had bought on credit, looked at him with an expression that was somewhere between amused and moved. I didn't ask for help with the fence, she said. No, he agreed, picking up the digger. Where do you want the first post? She pointed, and they worked side by side through the morning without talking much, which was a different kind of comfortable than talking. Physical work alongside someone, the particular rhythm of it, the way it requires a kind of coordination, a reading of the other person's pace and effort has its own intimacy, and by noon, when Edna brought out bread and dried beef and they sat in the grass by the creek, there was something between them that had a new quality, something quieter and more certain. You're staying then, she said. It was not quite a question. I've been in correspondence with the land office, he said. They want me to file from Austin eventually, but there's ongoing survey work needed in this county. It's legitimate work. I'm not manufacturing reasons. I didn't think you were, she said. You're not the kind of man who manufactures things. He looked at her. What kind of man am I? She thought about it seriously, the way she approached most things. Careful, she said, but not timid. You do what you think is right without making a theater of it. You're kind to children and straightforward with adults. She paused. You make decent fence posts. He laughed, a real laugh, full and unguarded, and Edna felt the sound of it somewhere in her chest in a way that surprised her and didn't. Over the weeks that followed, Clark Rourke became a presence in Edna Garrison's life in the gradual, organic way that things happen when no one is forcing them. He rented a room from old Mr. Dancy on the edge of town and set up a proper survey office in the spare room of the land office building, and he had legitimate county work that kept him busy. But he found time, with consistent and transparent intention, to be present in Edna's orbit dinners at the dining hall, Sunday afternoons where he would sometimes come to help with the property, and sometimes just to sit on the porch with a cup of coffee, while Clara chased the chickens around the yard and Edna read by the window. The town watched this development with interest. Caldwell Crossing was a small place, and a widow being courted by a land office surveyor was more interesting than most things. Opinions varied. Mrs. Prentice thought it was entirely too soon and said so to anyone who would listen. The Reverend Davies thought it was a blessing and said a prayer for it on Sunday, somewhat to Edna's embarrassment. The men at the saloon had a standing wager, which Clark found out about and found more funny than anything else. Edna's neighbor, Mrs. Hatch, a 60-year-old woman of enormous practical wisdom and no time for nonsense, pulled Edna aside one November afternoon and said plainly, "That man looks at you like you are the most interesting thing he has ever encountered in his entire life. I just want to make sure you can see that." Edna could see it. The question was what to do with it. She was not, she told herself, afraid of feeling something. She had not become that frozen. What she felt more than fear was a kind of responsibility. A responsibility to herself, to her own honesty, to be sure of what she was stepping toward before she stepped. She had made one promise in her life that had defined her utterly, had given her 8 years of genuine partnership and a daughter in this land. And when that promise had ended in grief, she had survived it by going very still and very inward. She was ready to come back out now. She was almost certain. But almost was not enough for something this significant, and so she was careful. Clark was also careful and also patient, and also which she noticed making no effort to be anything other than exactly what he was. He did not perform. He did not court her with grand gestures or borrowed bravado. He was simply, consistently, genuinely himself, and what he was, Edna found, was a man she trusted. And trust, she had come to believe, was the actual foundation of everything. There was an evening in December, cold and clear, when they were sitting on her porch after supper and Clara had gone to bed, and the stars were absolutely brilliant over the Texas plain, and Clark said, after a long companionable silence, "I want to tell you something about why the Garrison case mattered to me beyond the professional obligation." She turned to look at him. "My wife Sarah, when she died, we had a house in Missouri. Her family contested my right to the property. Said it had been her family's originally, which it had, and that I had no claim." He paused. "They were wrong legally, but they had lawyers and I didn't, and I couldn't afford a long fight, so I let it go. I walked away with my horse and my tools and my coat." He looked at the stars. "I have been thinking about that ever since, about what it means to have something taken from you through the manipulation of legal process, when you know the truth and can't get anyone to hear it." He looked at her. "When I saw your case in the land office files, the notes about the suspicious notarization, the timeline that didn't add up, I requested it specifically. Because I was not going to let that happen to someone else if I could prevent it." Edna was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you for telling me that. I wanted you to understand that my involvement wasn't just professional duty. It was personal conviction. I know the difference," she said. "I knew it when you walked into that courtroom." He turned to look at her and she was already looking at him, and the December stars were doing something particularly beautiful above them, and for a moment neither of them spoke or moved. Then Edna reached over and put her hand over his where it rested on the arm of the porch chair, and that was the beginning of the most important thing. His hand turned under hers and held it, and they stayed like that for a long time without any need for words. Christmas came to Caldwell Crossing with the peculiar muted joy of a frontier settlement in winter. There was pine bough decoration, and a church service, and a community potluck that the whole town attended, and Mrs. Hatch made a pie that was spoken of with reverence for weeks afterward. Clara received a set of colored pencils and a drawing book from her mother, and a beautifully carved wooden horse from Clark, that she received with the solemn gravity of someone who understands the value of a thing made by hand. She turned it over in her small fingers and looked at it for a long time, and then she looked at Clark. "You made this," she said. "I did. It looks like the sorrel mare that Mr. Belden has." "That's what I was aiming for," Clark said. "I've seen you watching that horse." Clara held the carved horse to her chest and said nothing, but the expression on her face said a great deal, and Edna watched it and felt something open further in her heart. That night, after Clara was in bed and the last of the Christmas candles had been extinguished, Clark stood in the doorway of the Garrison house with his hat in his hand and looked at Edna with an expression she had come to recognize as the face he made when he was about to say something he had been thinking about for a long time. "Edna," he said. "Clark," she said. "I have been in love with you since October," he said. "I want you to know that clearly. I'm not asking for anything tonight. I am simply telling you the truth of where I stand." The cold night air was coming in around the edges of the door, and the candlelight was making everything warm and golden, and Edna Garrison, who had promised herself she would be careful and be sure before she stepped, found that she was sure. She had been sure for some time, actually. She had been waiting to say it in a moment that was worthy of it. "I know where you stand," she said. "I have been standing in the same place for a while now." She paused. "I love you too, Clark. I was not certain I would ever say that to anyone again, and I want you to know the weight of what I mean by it." He came back inside, and she took his face in both her hands and kissed him, and it was a careful kiss at first, and then it was not careful at all, and the cold December night outside was entirely irrelevant. The new year of 1883 began with a particular quality of forward motion that Caldwell Crossing had not experienced in some time. Hollis's prosecution moved through the San Antonio courts with what passed in that era for unusual speed. The land office's documentation was thorough enough that the case was strong from the outset, and Victor Hollis was convicted of fraud and forgery in February, sentenced to 7 years in the state penitentiary. The news came to Edna by telegraph, and she read it standing in the post office and felt not satisfaction exactly, but something more like completion, a chapter closing, a debt paid, a wrong named and acknowledged. She walked from the post office to the land office building where Clark was working on survey documentation, and she came in without knocking. She had stopped knocking some weeks ago, and she put the telegram on his desk. He read it, and then he looked up at her. 7 years, she said. "Is that enough?" he asked. She thought about it honestly. "For Thomas, no, but for what he tried to do to the land, to me it's enough. It's the law working the way it's supposed to." She picked up the telegram and folded it. "I don't need more than that." Clark stood from his desk and came around it and put his arms around her and held her there in the drafty land office building, and Edna leaned into him with the particular ease of someone who has found, after a period of being entirely alone in the world, someone they can lean on. "I want to talk to you about something," she said when they had separated enough to look at each other. "All right. About the property, about what comes next." She was direct, as she always was. Thomas's plan was always to expand the herd and potentially bring in a second hand by the spring by this spring. "The south pasture is fully fenced now, the north well is good, and if I can get through this summer with a decent calf crop, then I'll be in a position to think about something permanent." "Permanent," he repeated. "I'm not talking about the cattle," she said, "though I'm also talking about the cattle." He was looking at her with those amber eyes and a warmth in them that she had come to think of as entirely hers. "Edna, if you are working up to asking me to marry you, I want you to know that I would like very much to marry you." She felt the laugh come out of her before she could organize it into something dignified. "I was working up to it, yes." "Ask me properly then," he said, and there was a lightness in his voice, a joy that she had been watching arrive in him over these months, replacing the careful reserve that had been there when she first met him. "Clark Rourke," she said with full solemnity and a smile that she could not quite suppress, "I am asking you to marry me and to be a father to my daughter and to help me build something on this land. I am asking you to make your life here with me." "Yes," he said without hesitation. "To all of it, yes." He kissed her there in the middle of the land office building, and outside the window of Caldwell Crossing February was gray and cold and entirely indifferent, and neither of them noticed at all. They were married on the 15th of March, 1883, in the Caldwell Crossing Church with the crooked steeple. Reverend Davies officiated with evident satisfaction. Mrs. Hatch wore her good dress and cried openly, without apology. Clara stood beside her mother in a new white dress that Edna had made from fabric bought in town, and she held the wedding ring on a small velvet cushion, with the gravity of someone performing an office of great importance. When Reverend Davies asked if anyone present had objection, there was a full 3 seconds of absolute silence in which Edna suspected everyone was thinking of Victor Hollies, now residing in a state penitentiary in San Antonio. Then Clark said, "I do," and Edna said, "I do," and the thing was done. After the ceremony, there was a gathering at the Garrison property, Garrison Rourke now, or perhaps Rourke, though Edna had strong feelings about keeping both names. There was food and music. A fiddle player from the other side of town, whose name was Abel, and who played with the kind of cheerful abandon that made the elderly dance, and the cattle lowed in the south pasture as though they had opinions about the occasion, and the March sky was doing that particular Texas thing of being enormous and blue and endless. Clark found Edna standing near the creek in a quiet moment between conversations, watching the water run clear and cold over the stones. He came to stand beside her. "We're married," he said. "I noticed," she said. "How do you feel?" She considered him, this man who had walked into a courtroom 6 months ago and changed the trajectory of her life with a folded document and a steady voice. She thought about Thomas, and she let herself think about him fully and honestly, the grief and the love and the gratitude for what that life had been. And then she thought about standing here now, in March, with the land behind them and the creek running and Clara's laugh audible from somewhere near the barn. "I feel like myself again," she said. "I feel like something that was taken from me has been returned." She took his hand. "And I feel something new starting which is its own thing entirely, both at once." He squeezed her hand. "Both at once sounds right." Spring came to the Garrison Rourke property with its ordinary frontier demands: fencing to check, livestock to manage, planting if they decided to put in a kitchen garden, which they did, Clara overseeing the vegetable rows with intense supervisory focus. Clark continued his survey work for the land office through the spring, which meant occasional trips to other parts of the county, but nothing longer than 2 or 3 days. And he came back each time to the house Thomas had built with the ease of a man returning to a place that is genuinely his. He and Clara had arrived at a friendship that was conducted largely through the medium of carved wooden animals. He had made her, by April, a horse, a dog, a longhorn steer, and a small figure that was meant to be a bear but which Clara had renamed Mr. Pudding, for reasons she never fully explained. She would bring them to the kitchen table and line them up and narrate elaborate stories about them, while Edna cooked supper and Clark sat with his survey maps, and they existed in that particular domestic peace that is only available to people who have chosen each other deliberately. Edna caught him watching Clara one evening with an expression she recognized. It was the expression of someone who has been given something they did not know they were allowed to want. She reached across the table and touched his wrist briefly, and he looked at her. "She loves you," Edna said, quietly enough that only he could hear. "I know," he said. "It undoes me every time." She understood that. She knew the specific undoing of being loved by a child who chooses to love you without being required to. In May, Edna told Clark she was expecting. She told him in the kitchen, before breakfast, with the direct simplicity she brought to most important things. She stood with her back to the window and said, "I believe we are going to have a baby." The expression that moved through his face, she had never seen anything quite like it on a grown man. It was like watching light arrive. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and took her face in both hands and looked at her as though she were something extraordinary. "Are you certain?" he said. "I'm not a doctor," she said, "but I have been through this once before, and I am fairly certain." He kissed her forehead, then both her cheeks, then her mouth, and she laughed at the completeness of his joy, and then she laughed more because she felt it too. She felt it moving through her like creek water in spring, clear and cold and real. Clara, when told, approached the news with characteristic seriousness. She sat with the information for 1 full day and then came to Edna and said, I would like a brother, please. I will pass that along to whoever makes those decisions, Edna said. Make sure they heard you, Clara said, and returned to her carved animals. The summer of 1883 was a good one. The calf crop was strong, better than Edna had dared hope, and with Clark's income from the land office, they were able to repair the barn roof and put a second water tank at the north end of the property. Clark hired a young hand named Pete Brewer, who was 19 and enthusiastic and absolutely useless with a hammer but very good with horses, and Pete proved to be both a practical help and an endless source of comic observation for the household. There was trouble in June. There always was some form of trouble on the frontier, because the frontier was still very much in the business of sorting itself out. A drought scare in the first 3 weeks of June had the whole county anxious, and several of the smaller homesteaders were in genuine difficulty. Clark went to the county commission with a practical proposal for coordinating water access from the creek system, drawing on his survey knowledge, and spent 2 weeks in difficult meetings with men who had never coordinated anything in their lives and resented being asked to start. Edna, who had her own experience with difficult meetings, provided tactical advice in the evenings that Clark received with gratitude and occasional exhaustion. "You should have been a lawyer," he said one night, when she had identified the exact procedural objection that would neutralize Commissioner Briggs's resistance to the water-sharing proposal. "I should have been many things," she said. "I'm happy with what I am." The rains came in late June, the drought scare passed, and the county commission adopted a modified version of Clark's water access proposal, which was 3/4 of what he had asked for and more than anyone had expected. He came home with the news, and Clara, who had been following the proceedings with the attention of a child who understands that important things are happening, said, "Did Commissioner Briggs stop being difficult?" "Somewhat," Clark said. "Mama said he would if you were patient," Clara said, and returned to her book with the satisfaction of someone whose advice has been validated. In August, 3 things happened. First, the ranch turned its first genuine profit under Edna's full management. Not a large profit, but a real one, enough to pay off the remaining credit at the hardware store and put something aside. Edna recorded this in the household ledger with meticulous precision, and then stared at the numbers for several minutes in the peculiar way of someone who has been operating on hope and nerve for so long that the arrival of material confirmation feels slightly unreal. Second, a letter arrived from Clark's brother in Missouri, the first contact they had had in several years. It was carefully written, somewhat formal, clearly an attempt at reconciliation. Clark read it twice and then sat with it for a while before showing it to Edna. "What do you want to do?" she asked. "I think I want to reply," he said. "I think we have a child coming, and I don't want to be the kind of man who holds grudges past the point of usefulness." "That seems right," she said. He wrote back that evening, a letter that was also careful and somewhat formal, but which Edna, reading it, thought contained more genuine warmth than Clark perhaps realized he was expressing. Third, toward the end of August, Edna's neighbor Mrs. Hatch suffered a fall that left her with a badly broken wrist, and Edna, despite being 7 months pregnant and in possession of a full ranch to run, became the primary person looking after her. Clark, coming home to find Edna had been at Mrs. Hatch's place since morning, said nothing, but the following day he began stopping by Mrs. Hatch's on his way back from survey work with food from town and a willingness to carry anything heavy, and this arrangement continued without anyone formally discussing it until Mrs. Hatch was sufficiently recovered. She thanked him with the gruff directness of a woman who does not do sentiment but means what she says. "You'll do," Mrs. Hatch told him one September afternoon, which Edna later informed him was the highest compliment in Mrs. Hatch's vocabulary. He received this information with the appropriate gravity. The baby came on the 6th of October, 1883, a year almost exactly from the day Edna had walked into the Harlan County courthouse. The labor was long, and the midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Aldies, kept Clark stationed on the porch with Pete for most of it, which was probably wise given that Clark had spent 6 hours wearing a path in the porch boards. When Mrs. Aldi's came to the door and said, "You have a boy," Clark stood absolutely still for a moment, as if the information needed time to travel from his ears to his heart. Then he went inside. Edna was tired in a way that went all the way down to something fundamental, but her eyes were open and she was holding the baby. And when Clark came to the bedside and looked at the red-faced, loudly protesting infant in her arms, she watched his face do that thing again, the arrival of light, and she thought, there are moments in a life that are so completely themselves that you know you will carry them forward forever. "Hello," Clark said softly to the baby. The baby, having opinions, expressed them. Clark reached down and very carefully touched the tiny fisted hand with one finger, and the baby's fingers opened and closed around it, and Clark said nothing further for a long time. "Clara wants a name report immediately," Edna said when she could speak. Clark looked at her. "What shall we call him?" "I was thinking Thomas," Edna said, "if you are willing." Something moved in his face that she could not fully name. "Thomas," he said. "Yes, Thomas Clark Rourke." "Thomas Clark Garrison Rourke," she said with a look that was mild and entirely non-negotiable. He laughed. "Thomas Clark Garrison Rourke," he agreed. Clara was brought in shortly after and examined her brother with the expression of a naturalist, studying a new and somewhat puzzling specimen. She had, it turned out, received exactly the outcome she had requested, and she received this confirmation of the universe's cooperation with quiet satisfaction. "He's very small," she said. "He'll get bigger," Edna said. "He makes a great deal of noise for something so small," Clara observed. "You did too," Edna told her. "You drove your father to distraction in your first week." Clara considered this, looked at the baby, and then looked at Clark. "He looks like you a little bit," she said. Around the forehead. Clark looked genuinely pleased by this, which Edna found charming. "Do you think so?" "Yes," Clara said, with the confidence of someone who has settled the matter. "He can have the carved bear when he's old enough not to put it in his mouth." She paused. "I'll make him a new one by then, a better one." Edna reached out and took Clara's hand. "He is going to have a very good sister." "Yes," Clara said simply, "he is." The winter of 1883 settled over the Garrison Rourke property with the solid quality of something established. There were the regular challenges of a frontier winter, keeping the livestock through the cold, managing the firewood supply, the particular cabin fever of long, dark evenings. But there was also a fullness to those evenings that Edna had not known for several years, Clark working at the table on his survey reports while she nursed Thomas, Clara drawing at the other end of the table with her colored pencils, the fire going strong, Pete Brewer occasionally appearing at the kitchen door with a question about one of the horses, and then staying for supper, because he was 19 and lonely, and they had long since adopted him as an informal extension of the household. On New Year's Eve, when Clara was asleep and Thomas was asleep and the fire had burned low, Edna and Clark sat together on the narrow settee with a blanket across their laps and talked in the quiet way they had come to favor for the hours after midnight, when the world outside was cold and still and entirely theirs. "I have been thinking about next year," Edna said. "What about it?" "Expanding the herd. Possibly as far as the North Quarter. The grass up there is excellent, and it's been running to waste since before." She paused at the careful navigation of the sentence. "I also want to pursue the teaching certification." Clark turned to look at her. "Teaching?" "The schoolhouse needs a teacher. Miss Graves is leaving in the spring to marry someone in Houston. There are 12 children in Caldwell Crossing of school age and no one to teach them. She was very direct about it. I have the education for it. I was certified in Missouri before Thomas and I came west. The certification will need updating, but it's achievable." "You want to run the ranch and teach school," Clark said. "I want to be useful in more than one direction," she said. "I always have." He looked at her with that particular expression, the one that was, she had come to understand, simply him being fully awake to her. "What do you need from me?" "I need you to be willing to take on more of the morning ranch work during the school term. Pete can handle most of it, but the organization, done, he said. She looked at him. I haven't finished explaining. Edna, he said, whatever you need to make that happen, I will do. That's not a condition, that's just true. She leaned against his shoulder. Outside, somewhere distant, someone in Caldwell Crossing was firing a pistol into the sky to mark the new year in the traditional manner, which Edna had always found both cheerful and somewhat impractical. The fire popped. Thomas made a small sound from his cradle and settled again. The new year arrived. Happy 1884, Clark said. Happy 1884, she said. The spring of 1884 arrived with the particular energy of a season that has things to prove after a hard winter. The calf crop was again strong. They were developing a reputation in the county for sound breeding stock, which was meaningful, and Edna obtained her updated teaching certification from the County Board of Education in April, which required precisely as much bureaucratic navigation as she had expected, and which she navigated with her characteristic combination of meticulous preparation and absolute refusal to be told no. She began teaching the first week of May. There were 14 children on the roll by then, ranging in age from 6 to 13, and the schoolhouse was a drafty frame building that needed its windows resealed, which Clark and Pete attended to on a Saturday in late April. Edna walked into her classroom on the first morning with the same quality of nerve that she had brought into the courthouse 2 years ago, and she found it served her equally well. The children of Caldwell Crossing were, for the most part, the children of people who had been too busy surviving to pay close attention to education, and they arrived with the mixture of indifference, anxiety, and unexpected brightness that children always bring. Edna treated them with the same respect she offered adults, which they seemed to find simultaneously confusing and compelling. By the end of the first week, she had 3 genuinely gifted students who simply had not had anyone expect anything of them before, and the satisfaction of watching that recognition move through a child's face the moment they understood that they could do the thing was something Edna filed away as one of the better discoveries of her life. Clara, who was now in her mother's class, navigated the particular complexity of having your mother as your teacher with what Edna considered impressive maturity, and what Clara herself considered simply obvious. Of course, school was school and home was home, and anyone who couldn't tell the difference was not paying attention. Clark came to the schoolhouse one afternoon in June to fix a window that had come loose in a rainstorm, and he stood in the doorway and watched Edna teaching a geography lesson for a few minutes without her noticing him. She was drawing the United States on the chalkboard with the assurance of someone who finds maps deeply interesting, and the children were genuinely engaged. He could see it leaning forward, asking questions, and she was answering the questions and asking others back in a rhythm that was pedagogically elegant and looked entirely effortless. She turned and saw him and raised her eyebrows, and he held up his tools to indicate the window, and she made a brief gesture of permission and kept teaching. He fixed the window and left, and that evening he told her he had watched her teach. And, she said, "You are magnificent at it," he said simply. She absorbed this. "I find I love it. I did not expect to love it as much as I do. I know it shows." She was quiet for a moment, thinking about something. Then she said, "I have been thinking about what this town needs, what it's going to need as it grows. The courthouse situation, what happened with Holly's, that wasn't just about one crooked speculator. It was about a system with no one looking at it, no real oversight, no one whose job it is to notice when things are wrong." "That's a broader problem than Caldwell Crossing," Clark said. "Yes, but Caldwell Crossing is where we are." She looked at him. "I want to be on the county education board. I want there to be a citizens oversight committee for land filings. I want Judge Ferris to know that people are paying attention now." Clark was quiet for a moment. "That is a very large ambition for a woman in Harlan County, Texas, in 1884. "I know," she said. "I intend to be patient and strategic and absolutely persistent." He smiled the full, unguarded smile that she had watched arrive over the past 2 years and that she considered one of the better things she had done, in a modest way, in restoring. "I believe you," he said. "How can I help?" She told him, and he listened, and they talked until well past midnight about what a town could be if the people in it decided to demand better of it. And the fire burned low and Thomas slept, and Clara's drawings of horses and landscapes were spread across the table between their coffee cups, and the Texas night outside was enormous and full of stars. The summer of 1884 brought Clark's brother Henry to Caldwell Crossing. He arrived on the afternoon stage from the railroad junction, carrying a single bag and the same careful, formal manner that had characterized his letter. A man in his early 40s with Clark's coloring, and a reserve that was somewhat more defensive than Clark's. He was, Edna determined in the first hour of meeting him, a man who had done something he regretted and was not certain he had any right to be received with warmth, and this honest uncertainty made her like him more than she might have otherwise. She fed him supper and put him in the spare room and made no particular ceremony of any of it, and over the 3 days of his visit she watched Clark and his brother perform the careful, tentative work of two people reestablishing a connection that had been frayed by distance and silence. It was not easy. There were moments of awkwardness and moments where old things surfaced and had to be acknowledged. But it was real, and by the time Henry left with an invitation to return at Christmas, something had been repaired that Clark had apparently carried as a weight he was only now recognizing. "How do you feel?" Edna asked after Henry's stage had departed. "Better," Clark said. "Strange and better." "Good," she said. "Both of those make sense." Thomas, who was 9 months old and had recently discovered walking as a concept worth investigating, chose this moment to fall down in the yard with his characteristic combination of surprise and indignation. And Clark went to pick him up, and Clara came running from the garden, and Pete Brewer, passing with a bucket, stopped to observe and offer the opinion that Thomas was going to be a handful, which everyone agreed was the most likely outcome. In October, 2 years after the courthouse hearing, Edna was appointed to the Harlan County Education Board, the first woman to hold such a position in the county's history. The appointment came after a campaign that had involved several months of quiet, persistent advocacy, 2 formal meetings with the county commissioner, and 1 very long letter to the state education office in Austin that Clark had helped her draft and redraft until it was exactly right. When the official notification arrived, Edna read it at the kitchen table and set it down and did not say anything for several seconds. "What does it say?" Clara asked, who had been watching with attention. "It says," Edna said, "that I have been appointed to the County Education Board." Clara looked at her mother with the steadiness of someone who had known since October of 1882 that her mother was the most capable person in any room. "Of course," she said. Clark, from across the table, was watching Edna with that expression that was only ever for her. She looked at him, and he raised his coffee cup in a small private toast, and she smiled a full, unguarded smile that she had gradually stopped hiding from the world. The land produced well that autumn. The herd had grown to the point where they needed to think seriously about hiring a second permanent hand, and Pete Brewer, who had grown from a 19-year-old of boundless enthusiasm and limited practical sense into a 21-year-old of somewhat more tempered enthusiasm and considerably better practical sense, agreed to stay on as foreman, a title he received with an expression of pure, uncomplicated joy. The house Thomas had built was extended that fall with a new room off the back, built by Clark and Pete over 3 weekends, with intermittent consultation from Clara regarding window placement, and a continuous stream of opinions from Thomas, who at a year old had views on most things and the vocal capacity to express them. It was not a large room, but it was solid, and when it was finished and Edna walked through it, she ran her hands along the new wall and thought about Thomas building this house room by room in the years after they had first arrived, and the continuity of it, The way the new would join the old felt like something important she could not entirely articulate, but understood completely. Christmas of 1884 was the best one in recent memory. Henry came down from Missouri as he had been invited, and the house was full in a way that was new and loud and very good. Clara organized the Christmas decorations with military precision. Thomas, who was 14 months old and walking with the determination of someone who has somewhere very important to be, got into the dried fruit twice and was deflected both times by Clara, who had appointed herself his primary supervisory authority. Mrs. Hatch came for Christmas dinner and ate 2 portions of everything, and said at the end that she had nothing to add. After dinner, when the children were in bed and Henry had retired and the house was quiet, Clark and Edna sat by the fire and Edna said, "I want to tell you something." "Tell me," he said. "I am not sure I would have survived the last 2 years, really survived them, as a full person without you. I want to be careful about saying that because I know I am strong enough to have managed alone. I have managed alone, but there is a difference between managing and living, and you are the reason I am living rather than managing." He was quiet for a moment. The fire was low and warm, and the house around them held the particular stillness of a full place at rest. "You walked into that courthouse," he said, "with nothing but a letter and the truth and the nerve to stand up in front of a rigged proceeding and insist that someone hear you. I did not create that. That is entirely you. I just happened to be carrying information that was useful." "You came in," she said. "You didn't have to. You could have filed your documentation and let the case proceed. You chose to walk into that room and stand up." "Yes," he said, "I chose that, because it was right and because," he paused, "and because there was something about you that made me want to make sure you had every possible support, which I understand now is what love is, or the beginning of it. I just didn't have a name for it yet." She leaned against him and he put his arm around her and they watched the fire for a while. "What do you want from the next 10 years?" she asked. He thought about it with the seriousness she brought to things. "This," he said. "Exactly this, with more of what we haven't thought of yet." "That's a good answer," she said. "What do you want?" She thought about the schoolhouse and the education board and the land outside and Clara and Thomas, and the way the Texas sky looked in October when the light was exactly right. She thought about the courthouse in 1882 and the folded letter in her pocket and the moment the door had opened and Clark Rourke had walked through it. She thought about Thomas Garrison, whose name was in the creek and the fences and the walls of this house and the dark eyes of their daughter, and she held that grief and love together with the present joy in the way she had learned to, not either or but both, simultaneously, which was the only honest way. "More of the same," she said, "and the things I can't see yet." In the spring of 1885, Edna began a campaign to establish a lending library in Caldwell Crossing, a single room of books, available to anyone in the county, which she argued to the board with the same methodical persistence she brought to everything. She obtained the first 50 books from a donation drive and the next 30 from the Austin Public Library's excess catalog, and she found a room in the back of the general store that was not being used for anything. And she opened the Caldwell Crossing Lending Library on a Tuesday afternoon in April with a gathering of about 30 people and a small speech that made Mrs. Hatch cry, which was unprecedented. Clara, at 12, was reading everything she could get hold of and had developed a particular interest in natural science that Edna encouraged without reservation. Clark brought her field guides when he traveled for survey work and answered questions about geology with the patient thoroughness of a man who genuinely enjoys the curiosity of a young mind and has no interest in pretending any question is too large or too small. Thomas, at 2, had the energy of a small natural disaster and the charm to make anyone forgive him for it. He had Clark's eyes and Edna's directness, and the combination was, everyone agreed, going to make him an interesting adult. Clara managed him with the authority of a much older sibling and genuine affection, and the two of them had developed a private language of sorts. Clara would name things and Thomas would repeat them back imperfectly, and both would find this extremely funny, and the sound of them laughing together in the yard was, Edna had decided, one of the unambiguous goods of her life. The cattle operation continued to grow through 1885. Pete Brewer hired a second hand, a quiet, capable young man named Sam Reeves who was from Louisiana originally, and who brought a different set of skills and a different way of seeing things that improved the operation in small but meaningful ways. Edna ran the books and the strategy while Clark provided the survey expertise that informed their pasture management. And by the fall of 1885, the Garrison Rourke operation was one of the more solid small ranches in the county. Not the largest, not the wealthiest, but consistently sound, and with a reputation for honest dealing that meant something in a place where people had long memories. That fall, Edna proposed to the Harlan County Commission that a Citizens' Land Oversight Committee be established, a formal body with authority to request review of deed filings that appeared irregular. She proposed it at a public meeting, with documentation that she had been preparing for over a year, and she made the argument calmly and in complete sentences, and with the specific detail of someone who has lived the consequence of what happens when such oversight does not exist. The commission debated it for 2 meetings and passed it at the third, and it was named, in the official minutes, the Harlan County Land Review Committee. The first committee chair was a retired surveyor named Morrison, which was appropriate. The second member was a local farmer named Aldridge. The third member, appointed by petition of the county residents, was Edna Garrison Rourke. She told Clark about it that evening, and he poured 2 glasses of the decent whiskey he kept for occasions worth noting, and they sat on the porch in the October evening with their glasses and the stars and the sounds of the land around them. "You have built something," he said, and there was a quality in how he said it that was beyond simple pride. It was something closer to awe, and she recognized it and felt it land exactly where he intended it. "We have," she said. "Mostly you." "Equally," she said firmly, which was not entirely accurate, and both of them knew it, but which was true in the ways that mattered most. He reached over and took her hand. The porch was the same porch where Thomas Garrison had built this house, where Edna had sat alone through the worst of the 14 months after his death, where she had first taken Clark's hand on a December night 2.5 years ago. It was a small porch on a modest house in a small county in Texas, and the stars above it were the same stars that had always been there, absolutely indifferent to human affairs. But here on this porch, there were 2 people who had found their way to each other through grief and fraud and a courthouse confrontation and 14 months of careful, honest incremental love, and what they had made together was real and good and entirely their own. "I want another child," Edna said. She said it with the same directness she brought to everything, not as a request but as a statement of desire offered for consideration. Clark turned to look at her. Something in his face was already moving toward yes. "Now, not at this moment, no," she said, "but I want you to know that's what I want." "Then that is what we will have," he said. "Just like that," she said, amused. "Edna, anything you want that I can give you, you will have. That is not a new position." She looked at him, this man who had walked into a rigged courtroom carrying a folded document and had not left her life since, and felt the fullness of the years between that October morning and this one. Everything she had lost and everything she had found. The land under her feet and the stars above her head and her children asleep inside and this man beside her who had chosen her as deliberately and completely as she had chosen him. "Clark," she said. "Edna," he said. "I love you." He brought her hand to his lips briefly, in the way he had a gesture that was entirely his and that she had come to think of as specific to them, something that existed only in the space between his life and hers. "I love you," he said. "I will be saying that for the rest of my life." The second baby came in the summer of 1886. A girl this time, born on a hot July morning with considerably less drama than Thomas had brought to the occasion. arriving in the world with an air of calm decisiveness that Edna recognized immediately as a personality that was going to be thoroughly her own. They named her Sarah for Clark's first wife, which was Edna's idea and which Clark received with the particular silence of a man who has been genuinely surprised by an act of generosity. "Are you certain?" he had asked when she had proposed it. "She was part of your life before I was," Edna had said. "She shaped the man you are. That deserves to be acknowledged." He had not answered right away. He had gone outside and stood in the yard for a while, and when he came back his eyes were clear and he said, "Sarah." "Yes, I would like that." So Sarah Garrison Rourke arrived in the world in July 1886, and Thomas, who was 2.5 and had very definite views, inspected her with the careful attention of someone verifying a delivery and pronounced her acceptable. Clara, who was 13 and had been reading about child development in one of the books from the lending library, was thoroughly prepared and immediately began singing to the baby, which Sarah appeared to find genuinely calming, to everyone's relief. The house was full and loud and organized, in its way, by the overlapping concerns of people who cared deeply for each other and were willing to do the work of making a shared life function. Pete Brewer got engaged to a young woman from the next town in the fall of 1886, and the household celebrated this as a full household event, which Pete seemed to find both touching and slightly overwhelming. He married the following spring, and his wife, whose name was Lucinda, was practical and clear-eyed and became friends with Edna in the honest way of two people who recognize each other's substance. The years moved forward with the quality that good years have, not uneventful, because life in the hill country of Texas in the 1880s was never uneventful, but grounded. The drought of 1887 required careful management, but the operation survived it. A dispute with a neighboring landowner over a shared fence line required Clark's survey expertise and Edna's legal knowledge, and 3 months of patient negotiation, but was resolved without courts or guns, which both of them considered a satisfying outcome. Clara, at 15, developed a correspondence with a professor of natural history at the University of Texas in Austin, who had read her letter about a geological formation she had observed near the creek with evident respect, and had written back with enthusiasm, which changed the direction of her thinking about her future. In 1889, Edna became the first woman elected to the Harlan County School Board, not appointed, elected, by the residents of the county in a real vote. She won by 37 votes, which was more than comfortable and considerably more than the people who had expected her to fail had anticipated. The election night gathering at the dining hall was attended by most of the town, and when the final tally was announced, Mrs. Hatch, who was 73 and had more opinions than ever, stood up and applauded for so long that everyone else joined in. Clark found Edna on the porch later that evening, when the gathering had dispersed and the children were in bed, and he stood behind her and put his arms around her and held her there under the October stars that had become, over the years, something she thought of as witnesses. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I am thinking about a woman who walked into a courthouse 7 years ago with nothing but a letter and the truth," she said, "and what she would have thought if she had known what was coming." "What do you think she would have thought?" "I think she would have been surprised," Edna said. "She was very tired that morning. She was not certain about very much. She knew the land was hers, and she knew she was not going to give it up without a fight, but beyond that," she paused, "beyond that it was all uncertain. And now," she turned in his arms so she was looking at him, this man who had aged well and honestly, who wore the years in the lines around his eyes and the gray beginning at his temples, who was more himself at 42 than he had been at 35. She looked at him and thought about everything that had been built, the land and the children and the school and the library and the committee and the election and the evenings on this porch and the kitchen table and the creek running clear and cold beyond the south fence, and she felt the accumulated weight of it not as burden but as substance, the solid real substance of a life well and deliberately made. "Now I am certain," she said. about almost everything that matters." He smiled, the full unguarded one, and kissed her there on the porch under the Texas stars, and the land spread out around them in the dark. 340 acres of grass and timber along Cutter's Creek, which had been Thomas Garrison's promise and had become Edna Garrison Rourke's proof and would be, one day, her children's inheritance. And the night was warm and quiet, and the stars were brilliant, and it was, in every meaningful sense, exactly enough. Clara left for Austin in the autumn of 1890 to study natural history at the university, the first woman from Caldwell Crossing to attend a university, which was noted in the county newspaper with a combination of pride and mild astonishment. She went with her mother's nerve and her father Thomas's eyes, and a set of field notebooks she had been keeping since she was 11, and she wrote home every week letters that were detailed and observational and full of the particular excitement of a mind, encountering the full breadth of what it can learn. Edna read them at the kitchen table, and Clark listened to her reading them, and Thomas, at 8, demanded that the interesting parts be repeated, and Sarah, at 4, demanded that everyone stop talking about Clara's letters and pay attention to her, which was clearly the more pressing concern. The lending library expanded in 1891, a real room of its own, in a building the town had put up specifically for it. There were 240 books in the collection, and a reading program for children on Thursday afternoons, and 3 women from the county who had learned to read through Edna's adult literacy initiative who came every week, and who had, between them, changed what the library meant to people in Caldwell Crossing. The years continued their forward motion, each one adding something new to what had been built. There were difficulties, there always were, and there were losses because the frontier did not exempt anyone from loss. But the fundamental thing, the life they had made together, held and deepened. In 1892, on a May evening when the land was green and the cattle were fat and Thomas was 9, and Sarah was 5 and trying to climb everything, and Clara was writing letters from Austin about a botanical expedition she had been invited to join, Edna sat on the porch in the late golden light, and Clark came and sat beside her, and they were quiet for a while in the way they could be quiet together, which was the fullest kind of silence. "Tell me something," Clark said. "What do you want to know?" "Anything, whatever you're thinking." She was thinking about 10 years. She was thinking about a courthouse and a forged deed and a folded letter, and the sound of a door opening in a room you had decided was sealed. She was thinking about Thomas, who had built this house and made this land and named it with his life, and about Clark, who had walked through a door he had not been invited through and changed everything. She was thinking about Clara and Thomas and Sarah and the years ahead of them, spreading out like the Texas plain, vast and undetermined and full of possibility. "I am thinking," she said, "that I would do all of it again, every day of it." Clark reached over and took her hand in both of his, the way he had for 10 years on this porch and at this table, and in every quiet moment the life they had built together offered them. And the evening light lay across the land that was hers and his and theirs, and the creek ran on as it always had, indifferent to human affairs and beautiful, and Cutter's Creek moved along below the south fence through the blue Texas dusk, and the stars were beginning to appear. And the house behind them was full of children and life, and the evidence of everything they had made together. And Edna Garrison Rourke sat in the particular piece of a woman who has fought for what she loved and won and built. Something with her victory, and Clark Rourke sat beside her as he had for 10 years and would for all the years to come, and the land breathed around them in the May evening, and it was completely, perfectly, and entirely whole.